Okay, here we are. Good. All right. Off of there now. So let me get us going here. I like to start. Okay. Welcome, everyone, to Autistic Voices Roundtable Discussions. Your behavior is not appropriate. My name is Philip King Lowe. I am the owner, producer, and host of today's Autistic Moment, a podcast for autistic adults by an autistic adult, and Autistic Voices Roundtable Discussions. For more information, visit todaysautisticmoment.com. Excuse me. This episode of Autistic Voices Roundtable Discussions is sponsored by Minnesota Independence College and Community and Looking Forward Life Coaching. My inspiration for the topic of this roundtable discussion came from a conversation I was having with a friend I have known for a long time who was recently identified as autistic. My friend was telling me about his supervisor at work reprimanding him for speaking out about how the working conditions could be made better for everyone if only they would do certain things. Their response to his suggestion was, "Your behavior is not appropriate." Just hearing that made me remember the countless times someone has said those words to me. I have heard of other autistics who have heard those words on any number of occasions. So I thought it would be a great idea to have this roundtable discussion so that these 6 autistic individuals can talk with each other and tell the rest of the world about how we feel when we hear those words from someone who is not neurodivergent. Okay, so that's what this topic is today, and thank you for joining us, and thank you to our panelists for being here. And this is going to be a great conversation. To those of you who are watching on YouTube, please feel free to leave your comments. I can't say we'll get to your questions, but by all means, listen to what the panelists here are going to say. And, if you're watching this and you have had an experience, write it down in the comments. I'd love to read it. We would love to read it. But I'm pretty sure every one of us here, all 6 of us, 7 of us, 7th would be myself. We've had that experience. And we're all here to share about what this is like for us. All right. So let's get going with the questions here so that we can all dig in here. So when someone tells you that your behavior is not appropriate, how does it affect you? And I'm going to merge this one with the question of, tell us about a moment when somebody told you that your behavior was not appropriate. How did you respond to that? And, tell us about that. So I'm going to let our panelists talk now, which is great. Okay, let's start with Michelle. So go ahead, you start.
I had a funny feeling you would start with me. Thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak. Mm-hmm. It's really invalidating. I put in so much effort as a person to be likable. I'm very high masking. So I put in a lot of effort to be professional and to get along with everyone. So, it's disheartening that despite my best efforts, my behavior is still at times deemed unacceptable by others. And one of the most memorable times that I talk about with my clients on the podcast is when in high school I was shunned. So I would walk up to my classmates and they would actually turn around and face the other direction. So I had nonverbal communication of my behavior being very inappropriate. And at the time, I didn't know. I was homeschooled and then I went to high school and I just didn't know what behavior was acceptable and what behavior wasn't. And so I think that's probably the most memorable experience of when I was told that my behavior was inappropriate non-verbally.
Yes, the unspoken rules that everybody knows but you, and me. I know exactly what you mean. Larissa, go ahead.
So growing up, I faced numerous challenges, and often I was told that my behavior was inappropriate, and there was negative reactions. So I would find myself excluded from activities, and I was even placed in mental health facilities as a child. So with that, I started internalizing the message that it was not safe for me to be myself, that being me was somehow wrong. And I started masking my autistic traits. I felt like I couldn't be myself. And this was something that was both a conscious and an unconscious decision, but it was really a survival coping skill that I utilized. But over time, I finally reached my breaking point. So I reached autistic burnout and I was exhausted. And I also at that point developed self-hatred. I wasn't confident. I had low self-esteem. I was honestly an anxious mess at the time. So that was a huge way it impacted me. And the other way was that often I would feel anger, shame, and frustration. And this would vary based on the person or the situation. And sometimes if people would call me out in front of other people, I would cry. Just really quick, the one time that comes to mind was the time a close friend wrote me a long list of all my behaviors that they said were not appropriate. And I responded with basically saying, I expected her to be herself, and I was just simply asking for the same common courtesy to be allowed to be me. And I also explained that if I'm looking around when we're talking, I'm listening and I can focus better that way. And since I accept her as she is, I want her to accept me.
Yeah. Yeah. I know exactly what you mean. Yeah. Cass, go ahead. Cass, are you there? Oops. I think she had a problem. I'll come back to her, Cass. Matthew, go ahead.
Thanks for having me, Philip, and thanks to be here with
You're
everybody.
welcome.
And I really hate the word inappropriate, and I reject the premise that there's such thing as appropriate quote unquote behavior when it comes to most of the behaviors that we quote unquote exhibit in terms of others. Now, I don't mean things that might hurt somebody or actually cause harm or disruption to another human being. That's a separate category, but the vast majority of times when our behaviors are being spoken about or being cited or being criticized, they have nothing to do with hurting anybody, disturbing anybody. It has to do with the perceived comfort and social norms of everybody else around us. And it's always the comfort of others which comes first. You can think of a situation where, maybe, the most autistic of behaviors having a meltdown, right? And when a person has a meltdown in public, which is not comfortable for anybody, and indeed for people who don't look like myself or you, could actually be extremely dangerous to have a meltdown in public, right? And the first question is almost never, are they okay? The first response is staring, laughing, gossiping. You're disturbing the party, you're disturbing the restaurant, you're disturbing the sidewalk. And as a society, we put an emphasis on that the social norms, these arbitrary social norms, and I don't say arbitrary social norms to be edgy, but literally arbitrary, made from nowhere, that trumps everything, not the safety of a human being. Not are they okay? Not, wow, they're having, and something's happening. Are they okay? What can we do?
Mm-hmm.
And that applies to almost every behavior, whether it's we're walking around in a meeting, whether it's being upset because the restaurant refused to change its hours on Google Maps or didn't have something on the menu, or if somebody is very blatantly being mean to others and us being upset, or us are having our own humanity denied and us being upset and sad and not seen and invalidated. And when we say that we're feeling invalidated, the first response to others is always an explanation of why, and why you're acting, the way you're behaving is out of order or not proportional. And it's always about the majority and never about the minority, which is us.
I agree. And you and I talked about this when we were talking about boundaries. Usually the person who's telling you your behavior is not appropriate is the person whose behavior is not appropriate. Anyway.
And it's never seen that way.
No, absolutely not. They never are they doing anything wrong. Never. Of course not. Yes. Scott, go ahead.
That's going to be a hard one to follow, Matthew. I want to reference some of the things that you had said in a moment, but to answer the question, Philip, I've got two things, and I'll speak to them in generalities rather than super specifics. But both of them are in the professional world as well as the personal world. One of them is communication, and so a lot of times, and with some people, it's even on a daily basis, how I say things and how I share what's on my mind. Everyone here probably resonates with this. It's direct, but it's not rude. It's not demeaning. It's direct. And I get frustrated when people answer questions or communicate in very ambiguous or very vague ways. And then when I ask them a very specific question to get that clarity that I need, they add more context. I'm like, just answer the question asked. But I get pegged, like what Matthew was saying, I get pegged with the one who's a bad communicator. And then the other example is stimming. And I'll answer this one in particular from a before and after. Before I was formally identified as being autistic 3 years ago, and after. Two of the big things that I do in stimming is I bounce my leg and I bite my fingernails. I'll even twist my beard hair. And before I would get people would ask me, stop doing that. And I would do that because I was, brought up, if it's bothering somebody, don't do it. But that would leave me feeling very frustrated because I didn't know what stimming was myself and why I was doing it. But after and learning what stimming is from this wonderful community that we're in of other autistic people, I'm better able now to say, okay, it's bothering you. I understand. However, let me share what it does for me and why I'm doing this. And again, it goes back to what Matthew said. Ask the why. Why is this person doing this versus going straight into stop? And so, again, that's really frustrating. But there's one thing that Matthew had brought up that I really want to respond to as well, because it kind of encapsulates how I view this question. And that is, like you, Matthew, I reject this premise of there's something appropriate. It's a very narrow majority perspective on what we do, why we do it, and things like that. And much like him, as long as whatever I'm doing does not hurt somebody physically, mentally, psychologically, whatever, and it doesn't violate any human rights, there is nothing that's inappropriate. It's and if you follow my LinkedIn and the questions I ask, there's that socially accepted part of it. And we really got to rethink this whole idea of what is appropriate, what is acceptable, and be more open to different experiences and ways of expressing and communicating ourselves. And this idea of that's inappropriate. Maybe for you, but not for me. So here we are. What are we going to do about it?
Mm-hmm. Yes. I had become a believer in the thing that, because my father always used to say to me, if I didn't know what a 4x4 was, then I had no common sense. I no longer believe in the word common sense. I believe in the word common courtesy, but not the word common sense. Sorry, but that one's off my radar. Devin, go ahead.
Yeah. So the question was kind of what have we felt when we heard the phrase, your behavior is inappropriate, and what are some times when that's kind of come up? And I know that for me, it can go two different ways depending on the context. A lot of times when I've been told that my behavior is inappropriate, I've felt really deep and abiding shame, similar to what a lot of people have described so far. But there's also times where I've felt instead defiance. So to talk about the shame piece, and just kind of an example of it, even though people have already illustrated it so well,
Go ahead.
when I was a kid, one of my main stims, one of my self-soothing techniques was masturbation. As a kid, you don't know necessarily how that might register to other people, what that even is. It doesn't necessarily mean anything sexual for you. And there was a moment where my mom walked in on me one time as a kid, doing it. And instead of having a more kind of reasoned discussion of, here's why you might be doing that, here's how you do that in a respectful way in privacy or something like that, she was just so taken aback by seeing that she said, I better not ever see you do that again. What you're doing is inappropriate. And I'm sure she didn't even literally mean it the way that she just said it. She was just shocked. But I took it literally, that what I did was completely inappropriate to do, not that it was inappropriate to, do it in front of someone or in a public area of the house. And so that year, I was a fifth grader, I want to say. That year, my New Year's resolution was to never masturbate again. And I had, years after that of thinking that there was something with it that was wrong. And I would kind of keep track of how long of a streak I had running, not doing it. And it wasn't until, later into my teens that I started to question, is it actually inappropriate or harming anyone for me to be doing this in private, or, with consenting parties. And there's so many things like that, just ways that my body moves, speaking too loudly by default, sharing information, not realizing that you're not supposed to give everyone all the information all the time, that I would just repeatedly get told was inappropriate. And so the response was to feel a lot of shame. But another example that kind of taps onto the defiant kind of response have been times when I was told my behavior was inappropriate, but it was clear to me even then that there was a value judgment being made there. So one of my best friends, again in childhood, who lived in my neighborhood, we would run around through the neighborhood doing all kinds of play pretend games. And one game that we played was that we pretended we were possessed by demons. And then we would crawl around, snarling at each other and saying satanic things and all that. And one time I went over to my friend's house and her parents had some kind of conversation with her about it. And they had set up chairs in the garage, and her and her sister staged a full-blown intervention with me, telling me that this possessed by demons game was not appropriate. They were Catholic. It was not appropriate for me to do that around them. And it wasn't appropriate for me to be doing it anyway, because, didn't I go to some church and so on and so forth. And I remember even right then thinking, okay, I'm ashamed that your parents think I'm a terrible influence on you. And this is going to inform my masking for years, or it would go on to. But even back then, part of me was like, there's definitely nothing inherently wrong with this, is there? It's just, it made them uncomfortable. And I'm going to have to get better at figuring out what makes people uncomfortable.
Yep.
And then this all goes into masking and all of those things. So these days, most of the time, I'm more on the defiant end, because I've been through that whole unmasking journey of questioning this stuff. But there's still always that initial like wave of like shame, I think, to push through into question.
And to be more precise with Devin here, this is one of those things that he's getting on the double two because a trans person is going to get the response about how their gender behavior is not appropriate if it does not line up with their gender at birth, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Everything about how I sat, how I spoke, how I described myself, even people would tell me was inappropriate at the time because I was just using
exactly
male language or like male norms. Yeah. Absolutely.
And this is why I got into my conversation with Nick Walker and several other people that I feel that when we talk about someone who is autistic, neurodivergent in one other way, we really can't talk about that without talking about gender conformity, because of the fact that there's a lot of things about being neurodivergent, autistic, all of those that deviates from people's expectation of a gender. So this is something that I've spoken with guests before and something you will hear in the future. A lot of us men, for example, who are autistic, we're supposed to be the types that we feel everything from the rough and tough angle, but we have these sensitive spots. And then, there are, with a lot of women, they're supposed to be genuinely passive, but they have their moments when they respond aggressively too. That doesn't mean they're less women. It just means that's who they are and how they present. Does anybody here have any examples of moments when you have been told your behavior is inappropriate that you didn't have the chance to talk about? And if you do, go ahead and think of them or write them down and let me know. I will tell you that I have gotten this response anytime that I have wanted to speak up for myself and say about something that I thought was not correct or not good. One of the examples that I gave in my advertisements about this particular show, and here's one for you. You're in a room full of people, a group of people, and they tell people, everybody there, we want your input about how to make this better or how to make this work better. The autistic stands up and gives their information, and then that you get told your behavior with what you said was not appropriate. You're in a room where people are all over you. They're saying, I think this stinks. I think this is terrible. They'll even throw in a few vulgarities somewhere. You're hearing everybody say all these things. The autistic stands up and says, I think this is bad because I hear people talking negatively all the time, for example. Just throw that out there. And before you get the chance to finish with what you're saying, someone there will stand up and say what you're saying or doing is not appropriate. Okay? You may probably even hear after the whole thing, someone who is leading the discussion, I thought what you said was inappropriate. Why? I'm sure everybody here knows what I'm talking about. The person who gave me the inspiration for this, he was giving his supervisor his feelings about how things are being managed. His behavior was inappropriate. It's really, really hard to get away from these things and really to have constructive conversations about this. Larissa, go ahead, say what you're going to say.
Right. Yeah, so moments that come to mind are where I've been told over and over that, especially when I was younger, I would be considered bossy. And I do believe there was a gender component, because if someone else did it and they were a different gender, I do think that they tended to get labeled with being a leader. Also, I would be told it was inappropriate for me to do things like questioning the status quo, or even self-advocacy, like explaining that I needed to know what to expect ahead. And also just simply being me, like how I talked, what I talked about, even talking about my passions and all of that. I just want to say real briefly what everyone else has been saying, that for me, there is not one neurotype that's better than the other. And there's a wide range of human behavior, because this is all very much human behavior.
Right. Very much so. You know, one of the last jobs I worked before I made the journey onto disability, I was working for a company that does that transports disabled people on demand, that sort of thing. We call it metro mobility. Like someone wants to go to a doctor appointment or go to a doctor, so they call up and they make arrange the reservation to go on a bus, and then they get taken there. Well, I was having some difficulty because I had 3 or 4 different people telling me how to tie a wheelchair inside that bus down. I had 3 separate people giving me 3, 4, 5 different techniques about how to do that. And so I finally said, okay, I want the man who signs my paycheck to come and show me how to get that chair strapped in there. I got told my behavior wasn't appropriate. It's just a wheelchair. I'm like, no, not for me. Okay, so there's those examples. We're going to go into the third question, actually, because I think everybody's, what might you like neurotypicals to understand what being told your behavior is not appropriate means for you? Think of somebody that said those to you, and what would you like maybe them to know about how that affects you? Scott, we'll go with you, and then Devin.
So I may have just kind of a short answer, because I could probably speak all day about this, but to kind of wrap it all up in a tight little bow is when people tell me that my behavior is inappropriate, the one thing I would really like them to understand is, by doing that, you invalidate my lived experience, period.
Yes.
You tell me that my experience doesn't matter and that my experience is wrong. That's crushing. That's crushing. Yeah, and I just want them to know, doing that just knocks me down a little bit every single time.
Yeah. It knocks you down, as you need to give yourself some time to recover.
Yeah, and it doesn't matter if it's something big or something really small. It has the same effect to me.
And I think the reason we tend to do that is because of how much we're told things like that. It's like every time, okay, I've been told it, I've dealt with it before, but I'm hearing it again. And it's like every day you've heard it again, and you have to go through the process of, I got a lack of a better word here, Scott, self-medicate it again, prepare it for the next shock again, that sort of thing. Go ahead, Devin. Go ahead. No, go ahead. Finish, Scott.
Last thing just to build on that is, over time, it creates a learned helplessness sort of situation.
Yeah, I agree with that. Go ahead, Devin. You're next.
Yeah, more than how it affects me, I wish that people who make those judgments realize how that kind of thinking is affecting them and limiting their worldview. Like, when you say that something's just inappropriate and that it's never to be done, what value system are you operating out of? Like, take a step to think about, inappropriate according to who, and who benefits from this being something that's unacceptable to do or to say, right? Like if somebody has that knee-jerk reaction of, oh, it's rude to talk about money in the workplace, it's not appropriate to bring that up. I think many people have talked about this long before me, but that norm exists to protect employers. It doesn't protect
Oh,
employees.
yes.
And the idea that it's not appropriate for somebody at a quote unquote lower position at a workplace to point out problems, that's just a method of entrenching power, right? Like it's just a way of maintaining the hierarchy. So a lot of times when somebody's told they're being inappropriate, what they're actually doing is challenging a hierarchy. And maybe that's something that needs to happen. There's so many just reactions of this is inappropriate, this isn't appropriated, that are motivated by discomfort, surprise, and just social conditioning that tells people what's not acceptable to do with your body, what's not acceptable to bring up. And it obviously really guts us, it shreds us. But neurotypicality as a social ideal, it is an oppressive social ideal for everyone. And I wish that the people who issued those judgments to us realized that for themselves too. Imagine a world where you were allowed to move your body a little bit more freely, where you were allowed to dress in a more comfortable way, where you were allowed to bring up tough topics. That would be a better world. So I just really wish that anytime someone found themselves having that reaction, they would just think about, do I really think this is inappropriate? Inappropriate according to whom? And like, can we actually talk about this instead? And I don't know, the world would be a lot better place for all of us if we could get there.
Yeah. I don't know if you heard, Devin, I actually had Kelly Lenza on this last week to talk about addressing fatphobia for autistic adults. And, they were talking about how, there's like 7 clothing stores that they can go to because of size limitations and all that. So, but what I like about what you said here, I like you said that about, I think sometimes when people are telling you that your behavior is not appropriate, it's their way of keeping themselves from learning something they don't know, or from having to move from their little comfort zones that they're in. God help them there. That sort of thing. Michelle, go ahead.
Yeah, so I definitely resonated with what Scott said and also with what Devin said. When someone tells you that your behavior is inappropriate, it's really invalidating and it's really hurtful because it's basically feels like someone saying that your authentic self is unacceptable.
Yep.
And it's not only invalidating and hurtful, it's traumatic.
Yes.
We, as neurodivergent people, are a highly traumatized group. We have little t trauma and big T trauma, but these experiences of being told that our behavior is inappropriate repeatedly over time would be an example of little t trauma for the most part. And it just builds and builds, and it results in us having this foundation of trauma that there can be learned helplessness that comes out of that. And something that I talk about in my program with my coaching clients is the judge saboteur, which is this tendency that almost all of us have to judge others and to judge ourselves. And so I would just recommend to everyone that's been told, your behavior is inappropriate, or anyone that's said that to someone else, question, is it your judge that's saying that? And what is the intention behind telling that person that? What's the intention behind the message being received? Where does that come from? What's the motivation? What's the end goal that you're trying to get out of it? And is it really necessary to share that information? And is it really necessary for you as a person that's receiving that message to take it to heart? Or is that something that you can just say, that's not about me, that's about them, and let it go?
Yeah. Yeah, I like the reference to it being invalidating. Several have said that, and I agree. Larissa.
Well, to echo what Michelle, Scott, and Devin were saying, it is very invalidating and it can be traumatic. whether that's smaller T trauma or not. But I would say most of all, it sends this message that we're not as valuable. I don't agree with it, but that's what it feels like. We're being told that we're somehow not able to be ourselves, and it encourages masking, which again is a major risk factor for autistic burnout, which is a risk factor for suicidal ideation and suicide, which is more common in autistic people, along with the self-hatred we've talked about. I know that ties into a little bit of what Michelle was saying. However, the other part that I would want neurotypicals to know that is related is if someone's an autistic burnout, that means they're doing what feels like mental gymnastics, because I have been there, where I'm basically adjusting my communication style, and it feels like almost all of my behavior to meet a neurotypical's communication style. But I'm also experiencing extreme brain fog from autistic burnout, which, you know, can cause even more burnout. So that's something I would like neurotypicals to keep in mind, because chances are the autistic person in your life is already making changes and adjustment for you, especially because we have been bullied or excluded or told our behavior is inappropriate. Lastly, to echo what others are saying, I did want to point out that there's a wide range of behavior. So there's many valid ways to listen, to communicate, to express yourself, to self-regulate, to explore your environment, many different valid ways. So like Devin said, the next time you find yourself wanting to tell someone their behavior is inappropriate, I would encourage you to pause for a second and ask yourself if it's actually inappropriate and harmful, or if it's just different behavior than the neuronormative.
Yeah, I agree. Matthew, go ahead.
No, as Scott said, it's invalidating. And for me, I would even put it beyond that. I want people to know that it's actually dehumanizing. You know, my behavior, quote unquote, is how I express myself as a human being. Living in a society should mean that we wonder if our fellow human is okay, or is there a reason they're doing something? If they need help, are they sad? Are they happy? Are they excited? And not pass judgment. We never know what's happening with a person. And we should never judge anyone by our own standard, let alone a standard which is completely arbitrary to begin with. You know, I want people to see us as humans and try to understand us as humans, just like they would want to be understood themselves. And, you know, like Devin said, behavior is always being used as a way of excluding us, putting us down, managing power dynamics, and using and controlling us, actually. And there's a lot of different intersections of that, of course. And this is why young autistic children, the first treatment, quote unquote, for those who are listening, is behavioral, quote unquote, therapy, not sensory integration. No one even thought of sensory integration as a first step until recently, 2013. People forget that for the history of autism existing as a diagnosis was always defined as behavioral. And the first thing that is done to children in the West is to try to drive out a child's behavior and destroy their behavior and destroy their entire sense of self. And it's actually targeted and manipulated at the first opportunity. And it always, when I speak about this behavior, I can't take the rabbi out of me, I suppose. I think of the famous saying by the Baal Shem Tov, was a famous rabbi from the 18th century, who always said that when you're looking at your fellow and you see a blemish, it's actually your own imperfection that you're encountering.
Wow.
That you
I
need
like
to
that.
correct that within yourself. And I wish that people would remember that when they're looking at us and speaking about our behaviors.
Yeah. Yeah. I thank you for saying that. And as long as you said that, the next show coming up on today's Autistic Moment, the next one is going to be overlapping triggers and soothers in autistic relationships, about what to do when you've got two different autistic people in the same room, and your triggers are their soothers and their soothers are your triggers. And we're also going to talk actually in there about like if you're autistic and ADHD and the triggers and soothers in each of those is kind of rubbing up against each other at the same time. How do we work with that? The second one in November, Sarah Dwan from Ireland is going to come on and talk about neuroaffirming therapies, neuroaffirming therapy options for autistics. Because as long as we talk a lot about the therapies that we don't want, well, let's talk about the therapies that are neuroaffirming. So that's where that's coming from. What I want to echo is the sense that what you've heard invalidating. I also want to touch on what that kind of thing can do to an autistic person. In particular, when you go through the years not knowing what's going on, something's not right, but you don't know what it is just yet. And then lo and behold, you discover that you are autistic, either through a medical diagnosis or through self-diagnosis, however you discover that. And lo and behold, you realize that what that person was saying was your behavior is not appropriate. They were talking about your autistic behaviors. Let me tell you that over time, you see, one of the things that occurs is that after someone identifies, a lot of the things about why certain things happen comes home to visit and to disturb. And that's why we call it post-traumatic stress disorder in some cases, because it comes in and it really causes, I'm going to say it, some hell, to put it mildly. And the thing is that we live with that, and some of us, we turn that over in our brain. And when we say something or do something, it repeats itself, it echoes in our mind. And some of that echoing goes into our being, and it makes us afraid to be who we are because we don't know whom we can trust to be whom we are. And that's where the masking comes in, and that's where the real damage comes from. I want to thank our roundtable panelists here, Larissa, Devin, Scott, Matthew. Tass had to leave at short notice, and we're sorry that they felt they had to do that. Some of our panelists have already kind of trampled on this. But I want to start by saying that in May of 2021, my guest, Dan Carmichael, was my guest for the episode Autistic Adults Living Independently. Dan is autistic and co-owner of GT Independence, a financial management services company that assists disabled individuals build self-determination by getting to be their own boss, their own employers, to manage their support services in their own homes. During our conversation together, I mentioned to him that I felt that we need more people to be better educated about autism. Daniel disagreed with me and said that he doesn't think we need more people to understand autism as much as we need them to change their thinking about what normal is. I think that at the heart, that is what is at the heart of neurotypical people's criticism when they tell us that our behavior is not appropriate. There is an old saying, normal is a relative term. I've heard him say that multiple times. One of my goals for today's Autistic Moment and Autistic Voices Roundtable discussions is to send the world a news flash. Being autistic is normal. Autistic is our normal. Us being autistic, that's our normal. And our normal and your normal can coexist. This entire discussion about our behavior being inappropriate comes from, what behaviors are defined as and because there's one other thing that we need to ask, who gets to define that? And why do neurotypicals get to define that, but autistics, we don't have a say in that matter? And that's what I think is at the heart of a lot of this. So on that note, I want to thank again our panelists, and also I want to thank Minnesota Independence College and Community and Looking Forward Life Coaching for sponsoring this. And you can look forward to more Autistic Voices Roundtable discussions in season 4 coming up in 2024. My goodness, 4 seasons. Anyway, which is good news. So I can tell you right now that for 2024, you can look forward to some shows on the podcast about employment. I'm going to have a show about emergency preparedness. What is an emergency and how to prepare for one? There's going to be a show about disparities in healthcare and education for Black autistic adults. There's going to be one about disparities in healthcare and supports for aging autistic women. And then there's going to be some talks in April about autistic culture and language. And then coming up is also going to be one about anger management and a post-traumatic stress disorder. So those are all kind of coming forward from the podcast, the audio podcast. So thank you everybody for being here today. Those of you who are here, and I want you all to know that you are all welcome to watch this one anytime you like. It's going to stay up on the YouTube channel. I don't take them down. So they're going to be there for you to see and get and share with anybody whom you choose. So for those of you who are joining us on YouTube, I want to thank you so much for joining us, and be on the lookout for future episodes of today's Autistic Moments podcast.